by request, England's finest.
So some reflections post conversation with Indestructo Boy, because those videos are popular and you've got to milk that algorithm, but also because I just want to think back and reflect on this success in the hopes of having more success in the future. Then hopefully we can get back to commentary, reviews, and all the normal stuff that you like. So thank you everyone for all the kind words and the positive feedback. I'm not used to it. It feels icky and wrong, but you mean well. So thank you. I mean, I don't want people to get too comfortable with thinking of me as the super reasonable guy or whatever, because I will disappoint you. We all fuck up. We all make mistakes. We all lose our tempers, or have a bad day, or succumb to the pressures around us. And these days, those times when you fuck up, or don't fuck up, you're just slightly less politic than usual. Those live forever. And what I think is more important is the effort. So if you like what you saw, try maybe be the best version of yourselves going forwards, and try to make similar kinds of effort to be reasonable, to be aggressively agreeable, even to people who are dead set against you. The effort's important, but I fuck up, you will fuck up. Don't beat yourself up too much about it. Just try and assume the best or least worst version of what people say or do, why they might say or do it. Give them chances, plural, before you cut them out, before you block them, before you mentally assign them to whatever dark corner of your mind and categorizations you use for people who are against you. I think about my positions all the time. I try to understand them. I constantly revise and examine them. I try to understand how I emotionally connect with these things as well. Emotion's unreliable and shit, because instincts and neurobiology that is adapted to the Great Plains of Africa isn't particularly suited to our current state of affairs. But emotions are real, and when you're aware of them, you can compensate for the bias that they create, and you can be self-aware, conscious of those biases and that emotion. So, post-conversation, some of my points of view are reinforced, others are recontextualized, perhaps. I haven't changed any of my positions, but then I've always tried to understand where the other side is coming from, even when I disagree. I think probably the initial push behind things like safety tools was at least meant to be positive, but I think since then it has become this empty virtue signal, a sort of shit test. I don't think it's useful, but I still think it came from a positive place, a nice idea. I just don't think it works. I think the effect is negative. I also think after that conversation that there are a bunch of things that are fueling this, what does seem to be mostly a generational divide. I think there's differences between the generational trauma of Gen X and before, and whatever it is that millennials, Gen Z and so on have been going through or not going through. And I think that is very culturally shaping. I also think that there is a social media driven puritanism that has everyone policing each other, living life under the social media panopticon, looking for anything, quote, wrong, unquote, that anyone does, and punishing them in part as a way to ensure that you look good when something you've done wrong comes to light, or to distract people from you, or to set up these tribes which feed the whole social media algorithm, being negative, being controversial. If we'd had a blazing row instead of an intelligent conversation, a reasonable conversation, then I expect these videos would have like 10 times as many hits, most likely. And we need to understand that, I think. And I think both me and Indestructible Boy play the game a bit. Me just with headlines and thumbnails, perhaps, because I'm a self-sabotager when it comes to success in internet media. Indestructible Boy perhaps a bit more in terms of content, but God knows I've had my rants and so on as well. But still, that's the game. And if you want to overcome that algorithm, if you want to see more reasonable conversations between people who disagree, then you're going to have to buck the algorithm. So I would ask you to like and share my video and Indestructible Boy's video of the conversation that we had, in an attempt to break out of that echo chamber. Whichever side of the argument you're on, whether you agreed with me or him, it doesn't really matter. I think their approach, even though I kind of understand it, right? I lived through political correctness and language adjustments and everything else. I think I understand why they have this position that they do around mental health and social issues. I also think part of the problem is the parents, which is people of my generation and one before. You're raising these kids wrong. But I just really feel like it's counterproductive, and goes actually against the evidence. And it's that feels like the much more pressing and fundamental divide to me. Since the earliest days of role-playing, once it entered the public consciousness, the people who've been critics of it and who have attacked it have constantly and consistently made the charge that we can't tell the difference between reality and fantasy. Oh no, not Blackleaf. And it feels to me like these people, well, not just feels, I mean, it seems, it looks very much that these people who are behind things like safety tools and so on, and this idea of bleed that's come out, the very concept of trigger warnings or safety tools, seems to try to suggest or to be based upon the fundamental acceptance of the idea that no, we can't tell the difference between reality and fantasy. And that was always where the criticism of fantastical play has come from. Whether it's Jack Thompson accusing computer games of being murder simulators, or Pat Pulling, the saying that losing a character or getting too drawn into the game, was so traumatic that you would kill yourself, that suicide became more of an option. All of these things, it's all bullshit. Same with the criticisms of pornography or anything fictional, really. I mean, you can go all the way back to when novels were considered terrible for people's mental health. It's absurd, but it seems to happen every time. And like I said in the conversation, the difference is that this is coming from inside. This is coming from inside the hobby. This idea that we can't tell the difference between reality and fantasy and get so caught up that our mental health is harmed, or our feelings are genuinely hurt by what happens in fiction. And for all you might joke about the death of Artax or whatever in the Neverending Story, I don't think that's true. I don't think the evidence that we collected debunking this stuff in the 80s and 90s is counteracted by that. This idea of bleed, the idea that trigger warnings have some sort of utility, which scientific evidence suggests that they don't. This constant hypervigilance for anything that might possibly ever offend anyone. Bullshit like the idea of cultural appropriation and so on. It's all aspects of this same problem where they seem to accept the idea that reality and fantasy cannot be separated, whereas the older generation of gamers very much took the opposite. For all that we chase immersion, for all that we want engaging and emotional and challenging stories and so on, at the end of the day we can still tell the difference between reality and fantasy. There were psych studies done on gamers, and we have a better capability as a demographic of telling the difference between reality and fantasy. So much so that when doing psych tests for things like psychopathy, gamers were giving false returns as being psychopathic, not because they were psychopathic, but because they could tell the difference between the construct of the question and what was real. We all know the Voight-Kampff test from Blade Runner, right? Gamers might fail that because they understand that when we're talking about the turtle on its back, it's not a real turtle. It is an imaginary turtle. It is a situation that is being described, not an actual turtle. So our emotional responses to the description of the turtle on its back struggling in the hot sun and being told we don't help it would be blunted, because we know that's not a real situation. I wish I could re-find the study. Someone, a gaming luminary, maybe Jonathan Tweet, maybe someone else, used to have a website up with all of these papers and things on it. It would be useful if it could be found again. But yeah, so I disagree with the very underlying premise that we can't tell the difference between reality and fantasy, and that seems to be the fundamental divide that underlies all of this. The idea that there is such a thing as bleed, that we need to be concerned about the utility of trigger warnings, like you really need to be warned about a description of a spider as opposed to an actual spider. Right? This really, to me, seems to be the underlying problem, because to most of us, I think, who are older gamers, the idea that the imaginary is any sort of real threat is just nonsense. But to these guys, they want everything bubble wrapped. They want warning signs on everything. Caution, coffee is hot. It's that's the thing that's really creating the division, I think. I may change my mind again, but that's what I've been left with after that conversation. I'm also sad to see what's happening, to an extent, to Indestructible from his own audience, in that he is being told he shouldn't have platformed me, shouldn't talk to me, shouldn't talk to anyone else. The usual shit, right? I have always been open to these conversations. My door has always been open to anyone who wanted to talk to me or even press me about any of the things I'm supposed to have done, and I've always been happy to explain myself. But nobody has taken me up on it in all that time. Really, there's been a couple of interviews, I suppose, for largely defunct gaming websites, but the conversation, usually people get run off, they get scared off, they get a bunch of people in their private messages telling them, don't platform this guy, don't talk to this guy, rah, rah, rah. Maybe because they were afraid this was exactly what would happen, that I'm an aggressively reasonable guy most of the time, and so the demonization of me wouldn't look so solid, perhaps. But yeah, I'm sad to see that Indestructo Boy is going through it, because I don't wish that on anybody. But a lot of the feedback does seem to be positive, and that's a good thing, and hopefully this can kick off some sort of broader change. The other major takeaway I got from this is that we need to leave room for each other, because there really wouldn't be a problem if they weren't trying to press these safety tools and these other things on us, if they weren't constantly policing what other people create and do. And that is the major problem with what we'll call Indestructo Boy's side. They will try to enforce these things by coding it into the newer game books and creating an expectation that a table will use safety rules, or enforcing them on conventions or stores or shops or whatever, by shaming people who don't use them, trying to normalize these things, as Ginny D actually said. I say thee nay, as Thor would put it. We should be able to agree to disagree, run our own tables how we wish, and leave each other alone. Don't play at my table if you want to use safety tools, and I won't play at yours if you insist on using them. And that should be a happy, tolerant accommodation of both sides, one would think. But no, that doesn't seem to do the trick. Anyway, overall, I think this was a positive experience. I would like to have more of them. I've always said I'm willing to talk about these things and be reasonable about them, and even to be challenged on all these things that I've supposedly said and done. Someone finally took me up on it, so that's a win, I guess. Yeah. Anyway, like I said, go back and like and share my version of the conversation video and his version of the conversation video, because otherwise, reasonable conversation doesn't tickle the algorithm's balls in quite the right way. So that would be mega helpful. Cheers. Zang.
Postcards from Validad is a darkly surreal tech noir game setting an adventure context for splatpunk and actual fucking monsters, or indeed any system you care to use. Validad combines cyber, bio, sci and narco-punk to create a Barrosian nightmare world of decadence, drugs, libertarianism, violence, glamour and oppression. You will delve into the strange lives of Validad celebrities, fiscal royalty and the seedy underbelly in this unique game setting. Available at post-mort.com, lulu.com and drive-thru RPG.